The sun burned white above the Mojave horizon. It was late July 1944, a dry, windless morning in inland California, the kind of day when heat shimmered above the sand like a living thing. Dust swirled against the rows of barbed wire fencing that encircled what seemed, to anyone approaching, like a silent town made of wood and wind. Beyond the gates stood a line of trucks, canvas-covered and coated with salt from the Pacific voyage. Inside them sat over 200 men, Japanese soldiers of the Imperial Army, silent, thin, their uniforms faded and stiff with sweat and sea air. Some still wore armbands from the island campaigns, Saipan, Guam, Tinian. Now they were thousands of miles from the jungles they'd fought in, standing on the soil of their enemy. The guards at the gate, young American soldiers barely older than the prisoners, had seen this before. They had been told to treat the prisoners firmly but not cruelly. The rule came straight from the top. They're no longer combatants. They are human beings under our protection. It was written into the manuals, repeated in every training session, and echoed in the minds of the men stationed there. As the truck stopped, the prisoners were ordered to step down. One by one, they climbed out, shielding their eyes from the glare. Many expected humiliation, perhaps even death. The stories told back in the Pacific said Americans tortured prisoners, that capture meant dishonor and agony. Yet here, on this strange continent, no blows came. Instead, something unthinkable happened. A private from Nebraska wheeled out a metal cart and began passing out small white cups, cold, dripping with condensation. The prisoners hesitated, confused. Some thought it was a trick. But the Americans smiled faintly, gesturing for them to take it. Inside the cups, ice cream. Vanilla, soft, melting fast in the heat. Nearby, another soldier carried cartons, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, and began handing out cigarettes. The smoke curled lazily into the desert air, mixing with the scent of diesel and pine boards from the camp's construction. For many of the Japanese prisoners, it was the first sweetness, the first comfort, the first gesture of humanity they had seen since their capture. A corporal from the 9th Service Command wrote in his diary that night, "They looked stunned. They didn't understand. Some refused to eat until others tried it first. Then they smiled. The first time we'd seen such a thing. It was like watching fear melt." For the prisoners, this moment would linger in memory for decades. It was not the taste of the ice cream itself, bland, American, too sweet, but what it represented. A world they had been told did not exist. One of them, a former corporal named Yoshida, later recalled to a Red Cross interviewer, "We were prepared to die in battle, not to be given kindness. That day, I realized the war we were told about, and the one we were fighting, were not the same." The desert camp fell quiet that night. The Japanese prisoners sat in their new barracks, still uncertain, still proud, but deeply unsettled. The guards moved along the perimeter, their boots crunching in the sand, the hum of the generator echoing through the still air. The next morning, the American flag would rise above the camp, and life, structured, repetitive, humane, would begin. But beneath the calm surface of that place lay something greater, a collision between two civilizations, two moral codes, and two visions of what it meant to be human in war. That collision had begun not with gunfire, but with ice cream and cigarettes. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. What began as a bold imperial expansion across Asia and the Pacific had become a desperate fight for survival. Island after island fell under American assault. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan. Each battle fought with ferocity that stunned even hardened veterans. The Japanese High Command had told its men that Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant disgrace and torture. For the imperial soldier, surrender was unthinkable. Death was duty, Capture was dishonor. Yet as the war dragged on and defeat became unavoidable, thousands of Japanese soldiers began to find themselves cut off, wounded, starving, and alive. When the US military realized how many enemy soldiers were being captured on remote islands, a logistical question arose: where would they all go? By the summer of 1944, the United States was holding more than 400,000 prisoners of war, mostly Germans and Italians, but increasingly Japanese. The Pacific Islands could not hold them all. Disease, food shortages, and lack of infrastructure made long-term imprisonment impossible. So, the War Department made a calculated decision. Japanese prisoners would be shipped across the Pacific to camps spread throughout the American mainland. California, with its vast deserts and access to Pacific ports, became one of the primary destinations. Facilities already built for German and Italian POWs in places like Blythe, Riverside, and the Imperial Valley were expanded and restructured to accommodate new arrivals from the Pacific Theater. The move served several purposes. First, it eased pressure on frontline logistics, freeing ships and personnel for combat. Second, it brought prisoners under the direct supervision of the US Army's Prisoner of War branch, which operated under the strict framework of the 1929 Geneva Convention, a treaty that demanded humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care for captured soldiers. To American officials, this was not only law, but strategy. The US wanted to demonstrate moral superiority, to show the world and the enemy that even in total war it remained a nation of rules. Every cigarette, every cup of ice cream, every polite word was part of a larger statement. America does not descend to barbarism. The irony was not lost on the guards who served there. Many had fought in the Pacific, seen friends killed by fanatical resistance, and yet were now instructed to treat their captives with respect. Some struggled with the order. Others came to understand it as a quiet victory, a different kind of triumph. For the Japanese prisoners, the shock was profound. The men who arrived in California had been told to expect death. Instead, they found fences without beatings, food without humiliation, guards who said please and thank you. It was more than kindness. It was psychological disarmament. Within months, word began to spread among prisoners and Red Cross observers. America's camps were clean, disciplined, and well-fed. Compared to the starvation conditions Japanese forces imposed on Allied captives in the Pacific, the contrast was staggering. The effect was strategic as much as humanitarian. US intelligence officers noted that humane treatment often made prisoners more willing to talk about morale, about logistics, about the state of Japan's crumbling war machine. Behind the barbed wire of California, a quiet front in the war was forming. One fought not with bullets, but with ethics and abundance. And it began with the long, silent voyage across the Pacific. They left under a grey dawn. For the captured men, the journey began in silence, bound, watched, and uncertain of where they were being taken. Most had surrendered on Saipan and Guam, after days without food or water. Wounded, dehydrated, and numb, they were herded onto transport ships under the supervision of US Navy and Army personnel. The voyage across the Pacific was long and disorienting. Inside the ship's holds, hundreds of prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of salt, metal, and sweat. Guard detachments walked the decks, rifles slung but seldom raised. They had been briefed. Do not harm the prisoners. Do not speak unless necessary. Each vessel carried not just soldiers, but the weight of two opposing cultures. The Americans saw exhausted men, beaten but alive. The Japanese prisoners saw a world of contradictions, enemy sailors who fed them, medics who dressed their wounds, and cooks who gave them coffee. Coffee, a drink unknown to many of them, became an early symbol of confusion. Bitter, hot, and dark as oil, it replaced the thin rice gruel they had expected. Some spat it out. Others drank cautiously, trying to understand this strange, civilized war. Days turned into weeks as the convoy neared the California coast. The journey itself was an introduction to American logistics. Every hour, meals were distributed. Medical checks were done with precision. The ships moved in coordinated formations, escorted by destroyers and aircraft, a floating demonstration of the industrial machine that Japan had underestimated. When the coastline finally appeared, a faint blur of mountains and sand, the prisoners leaned against the railings in silence. The Pacific, which had once been the Empire's moat of defense, was now their pathway into captivity. At San Francisco and San Pedro, they were offloaded in small groups. Military police oversaw every movement. Prisoners were fingerprinted, photographed and tagged with serial numbers. Their weapons, diaries and personal items were catalogued and stored. Each man became a number, each number a record in the War Department's growing archive of the defeated. Some were transferred to processing centers at Fort Ord or Camp McCoy before being sent inland. For those destined for California's permanent camps, like those near Blythe Riverside and the Imperial Valley, the next leg was by train. Through the small barred windows of troop cars, they saw a country beyond imagination. Endless farmland, tractors as large as tanks, towns lit at night by strings of electric light. In one account, a prisoner wrote later, "We saw more cars in a single American town than existed in our entire prefecture." That sight left them speechless. For men who had fought believing Japan was the industrial equal of America, the scale of what they now witnessed was a kind of revelation. When the train finally stopped in the desert, they stepped into a world of stillness, wind carrying dust, dry air that stung the lungs, and in the distance, rows of wooden barracks under a bright, merciless sky. The guards called it Camp Tule Lake Extension at first, later renamed under administrative reorganization. To the prisoners, it was simply the camp. They did not yet know it, but this place, quiet, orderly, and governed by regulations written thousands of miles away, would become a proving ground for America's moral strength. Their war had ended on the battlefield, but another kind of war, of perception, of understanding, was about to begin inside the fences of California. The trucks rattled over gravel roads, kicking up small clouds of dust that clung to everything, boots, rifles, and faces. By the time they reached the camp, the horizon shimmered in the heat. Rows of wooden barracks stretched outward in neat military symmetry, their shadows cutting sharp angles across the sand. A faded sign marked the entrance, U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp, California Sector. Beyond it, an American flag fluttered in the dry wind. The first group of Japanese prisoners was met by officers in crisp khaki uniforms, accompanied by interpreters and Red Cross observers. There was no shouting, no beatings, just clear, methodical instructions, where to line up, how to sign in, when meals would be served. The discipline was unmistakable, but it carried no hatred. Inside the compound, the camp resembled a small, self-contained town. Wooden barracks were organized by rank and unit, each equipped with cots, blankets, wash basins, and electric lights. The air smelled faintly of pine from the freshly cut lumber, an unfamiliar scent that to the men who had lived in jungles and foxholes felt oddly clean. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned but relaxed. The guards watched, but they didn't bark orders. They were young, some barely out of high school, and many came from far-off American towns, Iowa, Kansas, Ohio. They had grown up hearing about Pearl Harbor, and now they found themselves standing face to face with the men who had fought for that empire. For both sides, the encounter was surreal. The Japanese prisoners moved cautiously, expecting humiliation. They were prepared for punishment. They had seen what their own army did to captives. But what they found instead unsettled them more deeply. Order without cruelty, control without hatred. A record from the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office described the reaction. The prisoners' appeared uncertain, confused by the absence of overt hostility. Several bowed unnecessarily, perhaps expecting blows, but none came. Within hours, Each man was issued clothing marked with PW, stenciled in black. They were given soap, towels, and even toothbrushes, small items that felt almost luxurious after the front lines. Dinner came early that evening. The mess hall buzzed with the sound of trays and utensils. The menu astonished the prisoners: white bread, meatloaf, boiled potatoes, and coffee. They were permitted seconds. A few refused to eat, suspicious of poison. Others, starving, devoured everything in silence. That night, when the lights dimmed and the generators hummed in the background, the prisoners lay awake, unable to reconcile what they had seen. The camp wasn't paradise. It was prison. But it was a prison of order and abundance. In the darkness, a young guard from Oregon wrote in a letter home, "They look at us like we're from another world. Maybe we are. Out here, America feels like a miracle even to me." Beyond the fences, the desert stretched endlessly under a starlit sky. For the first time since their capture, the Japanese soldiers were not afraid of dying. What they feared now was understanding, the slow realization that everything they had been told about America might be wrong. And the following morning, that realization would deepen. For waiting outside the mess hall was something no prisoner could have imagined: a cart filled with ice cream and cartons of American cigarettes. The symbol of kindness that would echo through history was about to unfold. The morning of July 25th, 1944, began like any other in the California camp: inspection, roll call, and the clatter of metal trays in the mess hall. The sun was already climbing above the horizon, bright and unrelenting. The desert heat shimmered against the barrack walls, turning the air to glass. At 0900 hours, a U.S. Army supply truck rolled through the gate, escorted by 2 MPs. Inside were boxes of provisions, canned fruit, condensed milk, and something else. Cartons of pre-packed ice cream. The labels read, "Vanilla, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps." In a nearby tent, Lieutenant Harold Bates, the camp's logistics officer, gave a quiet order. "Distribute it to the new group. Make it official. They're under our care now." It wasn't charity. It was regulation. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated that all prisoners of war receive treatment equal to that of the captor's own troops. The U.S. Army had taken that standard seriously, not only for ethics, but for image. Every act of decency was a message to the world. America fought clean, even when it didn't have to. When the Japanese prisoners assembled in the yard, the guards appeared carrying trays of small paper cups, each filled with ice cream, already soft from the heat. The prisoners hesitated, uncertain. Some exchanged glances. One whispered to another, "Poison." But then a corporal, thin, sunburned, with a scar across his cheek, took a spoonful. He blinked, then swallowed. Slowly, his face changed. The sweetness was overwhelming, foreign, almost absurd. Others followed, timidly at first, then eagerly. A moment of laughter rippled through the ranks, brief, genuine, uncontrollable. It startled even the guards. Nearby, another soldier handed out cigarettes. Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, brands that had become icons of American life. Each prisoner received 2, along with matches. The act was deliberate. Under the Geneva rules, prisoners were entitled to tobacco, leisure time, and fair rations. A Japanese sergeant named Sakamoto later described that moment in an interview. "We expected humiliation. Instead, they gave us ice. Sweet, white, soft. We didn't know such food existed in war. We didn't know kindness could exist in war." The Americans watched quietly. They didn't speak Japanese, but they understood the reaction. One of them, Private First Class Raymond Ellis, later recalled, "You could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure if we were mocking them. But after a while they just sat down and started eating. Some even smiled. I'll never forget that. The ice cream began to melt faster than they could eat it, dripping onto the dusty ground, small white puddles on tan sand. The image was almost poetic. Frozen luxury dissolving in the desert, a symbol of a world far from battlefields and propaganda. For the Japanese prisoners, it was not merely food. It was a collision with an idea that their enemy possessed a level of wealth, organization, and compassion unimaginable in wartime Japan. It shook their beliefs more deeply than any bomb. That day became known among camp guards as the ice cream morning. No report was filed, no newspaper mentioned it, but in letters, diaries, and later memoirs, it appeared again and again as the moment when the enemy's perception of America began to crack. By nightfall, smoke from hundreds of cigarettes drifted through the camp. Laughter echoed faintly from one of the barracks, awkward, hesitant, but unmistakably human. And for the US Army officers who observed it, the experiment had worked. They had won a small battle, not of guns or strategy, but of character. The next step was to make that victory permanent through rules, routines, and the moral framework that defined every American POW camp. To understand what happened in those California camps, one must look beyond the fences, to the philosophy that built them. When the United States entered World War II, it not only brought soldiers, ships, and weapons, it brought an ideal. America saw itself as a civilized power in a barbaric war. From Washington to the smallest camp in the desert, that idea took form in a single document. The 1929 Geneva Convention, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The rules were clear. Prisoners were to be fed, clothed, housed, and treated with dignity. Their lives were protected by law. The US Army adopted the code with bureaucratic precision. Circulars were printed, distributed, and drilled into officers' minds. You will treat them as you would wish your own men to be treated. It was more than moral rhetoric. For the War Department, it was strategic. Humane treatment became a weapon, a soft power tool that could break enemy morale, encourage surrender, and serve as propaganda for the Allies. Inside every American POW camp, from Texas to California, the philosophy was the same. Strict discipline, structured compassion. Guards were told to respect the code even when prisoners refused to. Orders against violence were absolute. Beatings, humiliation, or verbal abuse could lead to court-martial. At Camp California, Lieutenant Bates hung a copy of the Geneva Convention on the mess hall wall, translated into Japanese by interpreters. Each morning, before work assignments were given, the rules were read aloud. The message was unmistakable. The Americans fought differently. This was in stark contrast to the treatment of Allied POWs under Japanese command in Asia. Reports of starvation, forced labor, and torture had reached the US through survivors of the Bataan Death March and the Burma Railway. Many American guards in California had lost friends in those same campaigns. Some found it almost unbearable to show restraint toward the very men whose army had inflicted such suffering. Yet they did, because the rule was higher than revenge. Captain Richard Foster, a camp commandant, wrote in his diary, "We will not become them. That is the quiet victory we can still claim." The system was not without purpose beyond morality. Intelligence officers from the US Army's Psychological Warfare Branch quickly realized that humane treatment encouraged cooperation. Prisoners who were fed well, given cigarettes, and treated decently were more likely to talk, sometimes casually, sometimes willingly, about their units, morale, or the condition of the Japanese homeland. It was subtle warfare, the erosion of fanaticism through decency. To the Japanese, whose military code was built on obedience and sacrifice, the idea of mercy as strength was foreign. In Japanese doctrine, kindness in war was weakness, yet in California, that belief was dismantled piece by piece. Even small acts, the offering of a cigarette, the fairness of rations, the routine of mail delivery, carried immense symbolic weight. Each detail whispered a message. Your empire told you lies. Look at the world beyond it. In time, Red Cross inspectors visiting the camps would note the transformation. Prisoners grew calmer. Work became efficient. Escape attempts were rare. Guards began referring to their captives not as the enemy, but simply as the men. And as that quiet order settled over the desert, the camp became something more than a prison. It became a stage, a living demonstration of what America believed separated it from tyranny. The Geneva Code was not just a law on paper. It was, in every sense, a mirror, reflecting what kind of nation America insisted on being, even in the darkest years of war. Next came the proof of that belief, not in words, but in the daily rhythm of life behind the wire. By August 1944, the desert camp had settled into a rhythm, precise, almost mechanical, yet strangely peaceful. The war beyond the fences raged on, but inside, time moved differently. Each day began at dawn with the sound of the bugle and the crisp voice of an American sergeant calling roll. The prisoners formed ranks in silence, their khaki uniforms marked with the black letters PW. The morning air was cool, almost gentle before the sun climbed high. After inspection came breakfast, oatmeal, toast, canned fruit, and sometimes powdered eggs. For men who had survived on rice and dried fish, the abundance was astonishing. The U.S. Army fed its captives at nearly the same caloric level as its own troops. A deliberate gesture, grounded in the Geneva Code but also in practicality. Healthy men worked better. And work was central to camp life. The prisoners were organized into labor detachments, construction, farming, maintenance, or kitchen duty. California's vast agricultural fields benefited directly. Japanese POWs helped harvest cotton, pick oranges, and repair irrigation ditches under guard supervision. They were paid modestly in camp scrip or canteen credits, which they could use to buy cigarettes, soap, or stationery. The system was efficient, orderly, and oddly humanizing. A War Department report from late 1944 noted, Japanese prisoners display discipline and industriousness superior to expectation. They work with quiet intensity and appear to take pride in the task when treated fairly. Every afternoon after labor hours, the men returned to the camp. There were recreation periods, volleyball, baseball, sometimes even gardening. The Americans supplied tools and seeds, and within months, the prisoners had cultivated neat rows of vegetables behind the barracks. To the guards, it was a curiosity. To the prisoners, it was dignity, a way to create order and captivity. Letters were permitted too. Once a month, prisoners could send censored messages through the Red Cross to families in Japan. Many wrote cautiously, unsure if their letters would ever reach home. Some never did. But the act of writing gave shape to their memories, a bridge between war and peace. The guards maintained a delicate balance. They were firm but rarely cruel. When rules were broken, an argument, a hidden knife, a fight, punishment came swiftly but fairly. A day in isolation, loss of privileges, never violence. Over time, mutual respect grew, not friendship, but recognition. Private Ellis, one of the guards, recorded in a letter, "They bow when we pass, and we nod back. We've learned each other's rhythms. Sometimes I forget they were ever our enemies." Evenings in the camp carried a strange serenity. The desert cooled, the wind softened, and from the barracks drifted the low hum of voices. Songs, sometimes Japanese folk tunes, sometimes fragments of American radio programs faintly heard through the camp speakers. The Army provided reading material, English instruction manuals, newspapers, and even technical textbooks for those interested. It was part of a psychological rehabilitation effort, the belief that exposure to American knowledge could counter indoctrination. And it worked. Slowly, the rigid faces of the captured soldiers softened. They learned English words. They smiled more freely. They began to see their captors not as monsters, but as men. From the outside, It was a model of military efficiency. But beneath the order, something deeper was happening. The quiet dismantling of myth. The Japanese soldiers had entered the camp believing America was decadent and soulless. Yet here, amid baseball fields, books, and the scent of fresh bread, they began to confront an unsettling truth. America's strength was not brutality. It was as abundance, calm, and self-assured power. The next step in that realization came through music, movies, and a culture unlike anything they had ever known. Even war needs sound. By the autumn of 1944, the California camp no longer echoed only with orders and footsteps. It vibrated with music. At first it came from the American side, harmonicas, radios, a stray guitar. Then, unexpectedly, from the prisoners themselves. The Japanese soldiers, many of them students or musicians before the war, began forming small groups. They built instruments from scrapwood and wire, makeshift guitars, flutes carved from pipe, drums fashioned out of tin. Within weeks, the barracks that once held silence began to hum with melody. It was the guards who encouraged it. The camp's recreation officer, Lieutenant Charles Dugan, believed that music softened defiance. He allowed the prisoners to perform in the evenings, under supervision. What began as traditional Japanese folk songs, soft, mournful, disciplined, gradually merged with American rhythms. From the guard towers, the Americans listened in disbelief as the prisoners began playing something entirely new: swing. Dugan had supplied a few phonograph records through the Red Cross, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and the Andrews Sisters. The music astonished the Japanese men. They had heard rumors of American decadence, but what they found in swing was not decadence. It was joy, precision, and energy. They listened, studied the rhythm, and tried to replicate it. The result was awkward, sometimes comical, but profoundly symbolic. Two cultures finding harmony inside a barbed wire fence. Music was not the only revelation. The camp's weekly movie nights became a ritual. Every Saturday, the mess hall was converted into a makeshift theater. A projector, loaned by the U.S. Army Special Services Division, displayed films on a white bedsheet nailed to the wall. The selections were deliberate: newsreels of Allied victories, short comedies, and classic Hollywood features. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stagecoach, It Happened One Night. For many of the prisoners, it was their first exposure to American cinema, a world of freedom, laughter, and human complexity far removed from the propaganda of Imperial Japan. One prisoner later recalled, "We expected cruelty and arrogance. We saw a country that laughed at itself. It frightened us more than weapons." After the screenings, discussions often followed, quiet, hesitant at first, then lively. Interpreters translated American idioms. The prisoners debated what they saw: democracy, humor, romance. Some refused to believe it was real, convinced it was part of an elaborate ruse. Others began to wonder if the world beyond Japan had always been larger than they were told. Letter writing added another dimension. Every month, the Red Cross distributed forms, simple sheets that allowed 30 words of message and address. The prisoners wrote carefully: health reports, reassurances, coded hints of astonishment. Some described America's vastness, its machinery, its food. A small number of letters made it through to Japan. Those that did created ripples among families and military censors. The accounts seemed unbelievable, that their sons were alive, treated kindly, even allowed to work and sing. For the Imperial Command, such rumors were dangerous. Reports of humane American treatment threatened to undermine the cult of death before surrender. Still, the stories spread quietly, whispered through channels that no censorship could fully contain. Back in California, the camp continued to evolve. By winter, the prisoners were not merely surviving, they were learning. Music, cinema, and conversation had opened cracks in their old worldviews. To the Americans, this was proof of success, a transformation through exposure. To the prisoners, it was a disquieting education. They were beginning to understand that victory was not only measured in battles, but in the ability to shape hearts and minds without drawing a weapon. The Americans had found a new front line, the psychological war of kindness. And in the months ahead, that quiet war would become deliberate, studied, and devastatingly effective. By early 1945, the US Army had learned something profound. Mercy could conquer where brutality could not. The desert camps of California had become more than holding sites. They were laboratories of psychological warfare. What began as humane treatment under the Geneva Convention evolved into a calculated form of influence, guided by military psychologists and intelligence officers from the War Department's Psychological Warfare Division, PWD. They called it conversion through exposure. The concept was simple. Treat prisoners with such dignity, order, and generosity that their old loyalties begin to dissolve on their own. The strategy stemmed from observation. When Japanese soldiers were treated harshly, they closed themselves off. Their sense of honor and defiance only hardened. But when shown fairness and trust, many began to question the beliefs that had driven them to war. Kindness, in this sense, became a weapon. Slow, invisible, but immensely powerful. At Camp California, this method was carried out with military precision. Prisoners were invited to participate in discussion groups led by bilingual officers. They were encouraged to read American newspapers and listen to radio programs. Translations of the Atlantic Charter and excerpts from the U.S. Constitution were distributed among literate inmates. The goal was never to humiliate Japan. It was to show contrast, to reveal through quiet comparison the moral and material superiority of the United States. A 1945 internal report described it succinctly. Our conduct within the camps must be the demonstration of democracy's strength. Every meal served, every right upheld, every humane gesture shown is a counter-argument to the enemy's propaganda. The results were measurable. Prisoners who initially refused to cooperate during interrogations began volunteering information, not from fear, but curiosity. They spoke of shortages in Japan, troop morale, rumors of disillusionment in the army. Some provided details about fortifications and supply routes. None of it came from torture or coercion. It came from ice cream, cigarettes, and the quiet dignity of clean bedsheets. American guards often didn't realize the larger purpose behind their orders. They simply followed protocol. Yet in doing so, they were unwitting participants in one of the most effective psychological operations of the war. Captain Foster, the camp commandant, later reflected, "They thought they were fighting a nation of savages. We showed them we were not. And that difference did more damage to their spirit than any bomb could." Some prisoners began keeping diaries, rare, fragile documents that survived long after the war. One, written by an enlisted man named Kinoshita, read, "They treat us better than our own officers did. Here, no one shouts. The Americans speak calmly, even when angry. They do not fear us, because they do not need to." It was this last line that US analysts found most revealing. They do not need to. That realization, that America's power came from security, not terror, struck at the core of imperial ideology. Outside the fences, the tide of war had already turned. The Philippines were liberated. The firebombing of Tokyo had begun. The empire was shrinking. Inside the camp, the prisoners could sense it. Yet instead of vengeance, they saw restraint. Instead of despair, they saw abundance. The realization was destabilizing. By spring, some Japanese officers even requested lectures from American officers on democracy, industry, and technology. What had started as survival had become study. In those final months of the war, the US military discovered that kindness, measured, disciplined, strategic, could achieve what armies often could not. It could reshape, too, the very idea of the enemy. And when word of this treatment finally reached Japan, the reaction would be one of disbelief, even outrage, at what their captured soldiers had seen with their own eyes. By the spring of 1945, whispers from across the Pacific began reaching Japan. Faint, improbable stories carried by Red Cross channels and censored letters. They spoke of captured soldiers living in comfort, working in fields, even laughing with American guards. Tokyo didn't believe it. The Japanese government's Information Bureau intercepted the first batch of Red Cross correspondence in March. The letters were short, 30 words each, neat handwriting, emotion stripped down to what could pass the censors. But between the lines, the shock was evident. We are treated fairly. Food is plentiful. The Americans do not kill prisoners. I have tasted ice. The last phrase became notorious. I have tasted ice. To Japanese officials, it made no sense. The homeland was enduring rationing and nightly air raids, while its captured soldiers spoke of ice cream in California. Within weeks, military censors were ordered to confiscate any further mention of American comfort. The letters were classified as morale hazards. To admit that the enemy treated captives humanely threatened the entire ideological foundation of the imperial system, the belief that surrender was a fate worse than death. In Japan's wartime propaganda, Americans were depicted as monsters, mechanical, cruel, morally corrupt. To confess otherwise was treasonous, yet the stories couldn't be stopped. Sailors, diplomats, and even neutral intermediaries from Switzerland and Sweden began reporting similar observations, that Japanese prisoners in the United States were not being tortured or starved, but rehabilitated. The revelations spread through whispers, black market news sheets, and rumors among families of the missing. Mothers in Osaka quietly prayed that their sons might be captured by the Americans instead of dying on the front. It was a thought no one dared to say aloud. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the reports caused unease. Interrogation transcripts from Allied POWs described brutal treatment in Japanese camps, starvation, forced labor, disease. Now the evidence suggested the Americans had chosen a different path, and it was working. A secret intelligence summary presented to the War Ministry in mid-1945 acknowledged the impact. Enemy treatment of our captives is unusually lenient and appears to aim at psychological conversion. It is essential that no Japanese soldier allow himself to be taken alive. But the damage was already done. In the final months of the war, more Japanese soldiers began surrendering, small numbers at first, then entire groups. Many cited exhaustion, hunger, or the futility of resistance. But among them were those who had heard the stories, of cigarettes, of kindness, of a land where even prisoners lived with dignity. In California, the camp staff began noticing changes as well. Newly arrived prisoners from late 1945 came less defiant, more curious. When asked about their expectations, they often said, "We have heard America is not cruel." It was a quiet victory of narrative, one that no bomb or invasion could have achieved. The image of the United States, shaped through acts of decency, was seeping into the consciousness of an entire enemy nation. For Washington, this was proof of principle. When the War Department reviewed reports from the California camps, they concluded that humane policy had produced not weakness but strength, a living argument for democracy's endurance. As Japan faced devastation and surrender approached, those same prisoners who had once stood bewildered in the desert sun now became witnesses to America's greatest weapon, not its tanks, not its planes, but its idea of itself. Soon, the war would end. The gates would open, and the men who had once fought to the death for an Empire would step back into a world forever changed by what they had seen in captivity. For the Americans stationed in those California camps, the war took on a different face. They were soldiers, but their battlefield was psychological, fought not with rifles, but restraint. Many of the guards were young, barely 20, trained at Fort Ord or Camp Claiborne before being assigned to prisoner detail. They expected defiance, hatred, even violence. Instead, they found quiet men who bowed when spoken to and worked diligently in the desert sun. The contrast unsettled them. Sergeant Robert McCall, who served as a perimeter guard in 1945, later recalled, "I'd seen what the Japanese did in the Pacific. Guys from my hometown didn't come back. I thought I'd hate them. But then you hand one a shovel and he says thank you in broken English. You don't forget that." The Army's instructions were clear. Firm control, no cruelty. Guards were to maintain professional distance, but humanity was not forbidden. In fact, it was quietly encouraged. Officers explained that courtesy was not weakness, it was discipline. A manual distributed by the Provost Marshal General's office phrased it precisely. "The treatment of prisoners is a measure of national character. Conduct yourself so that no act within these fences brings shame to the flag you serve." Most took that instruction seriously. The guards enforced order, broke up fights, and occasionally punished theft or insolence, but they rarely struck a man. To harm a prisoner without cause could result in a court-martial. The respect became mutual, if cautious. When an American soldier died in a jeep accident near the camp in 1945, Japanese prisoners requested permission to build a small wooden marker in his honor. They bowed as the convoy passed. The gesture left the guards speechless. Inside the camp, familiarity grew through work. Guards supervised prisoners in the fields, shared shade during rest periods, and exchanged simple words of English and Japanese. Water. Tobacco. Work finished. Small bridges, built in the heat. Private Raymond Ellis, the same guard who had witnessed the ice cream morning months before, wrote home in a letter now kept in the National Archives. "They're not what we were told. Most of them are farmers, students, like us. You look at them and think, if I was born where they were, I'd be wearing the same uniform." That recognition changed men. The hostility that once defined the Pacific War began to fade, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. Still, discipline never faltered. Escape attempts, though rare, were handled swiftly. Prisoners who tried to flee were recaptured within hours by local sheriffs or farmers. Punishment was isolation, not execution. Every incident reinforced the message: mercy with order, compassion with control. The Red Cross inspectors, who visited quarterly, often noted the professionalism of the American staff. Their reports described exemplary conduct and a high degree of moral leadership among enlisted personnel. For the guards, that moral leadership was not abstract. It was tested daily. They lived beside men who only months before would have killed them without hesitation. Yet here, behind barbed wire and the American flag, they were forced to look past hatred and into something far more demanding: understanding. As the war in the Pacific neared its end, news of Japan's defeats reached even the desert. Radios played bulletins of Okinawa, then Hiroshima. Some guards celebrated, others watched the prisoners in silence. They knew that soon the war would be over. The men they had watched, fed and guarded would be sent home, and the fences, so carefully maintained, would lose their purpose. For now they did their duty, steady, patient, unflinching, embodying the principle that had guided America's war of conscience from the start, that power meant nothing without self-control. On August 15, 1945, the loudspeaker in the California camp crackled to life. The guards stopped what they were doing. The prisoners froze mid-step. The voice came through the static, brief, formal, unmistakable. Japan had accepted the terms of surrender. The war was over. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then, from the barracks, came the faint sound of weeping. The announcement reached across the camp like a shockwave. Men who had fought to the brink of death now stood motionless, their world collapsing in a single radio transmission. The Emperor had spoken, an event unimaginable only weeks before. For the Japanese soldiers behind the wire, it was both liberation and humiliation, peace and defeat intertwined. The American guards, too, were subdued. They had spent months living alongside their enemies, feeding them, watching them, learning their names. And now the great purpose of it all had ended. Some felt relief, others a strange emptiness. Within days, new orders arrived from the War Department. The camp would be demobilized. Prisoners were to be processed for repatriation under the supervision of the International Red Cross and the US Navy. Every man would be medically examined, documented, and assigned to a transport vessel bound for Japan. The process was meticulous. Prisoners were deloused, vaccinated, and issued new clothing for the voyage. Each received a small packet of personal items, a toothbrush, soap, and a few cigarettes. The guards handed them out with quiet efficiency. One American officer remembered, "They bowed to us as they boarded the trucks. Some tried to speak but couldn't find the words. I think they expected hatred from us even then, but all we said was, 'Good luck.'" At the harbor, lines of Japanese prisoners filed up the gangplanks of US ships, the same kind that had once carried them across the Pacific in Chait, Ains, now bearing them home in order and safety. The Red Cross flag fluttered beside the stars and stripes as the ships set sail. On deck, the men stood in groups, staring west toward the horizon. For many, it had been years since they'd seen the ocean as anything but a battlefield. Now it was a mirror, reflecting a world that had shifted forever. Some left with gratitude, others with confusion. A few carried fragments of paper, notes written in broken English, names of guards they wanted to remember. One read simply, "Thank you for your humanity. I will tell my family." Back in the desert, the camp grew quiet. The barracks emptied, the gates unguarded, the watchtowers bare. American crews dismantled the fences and repurposed the lumber for storage sheds. The sand reclaimed the footprints. Only the wind remained, whispering across a place that had once been both a prison and a lesson. In Washington, officials compiled final reports. Out of thousands of Japanese prisoners held in the continental United States, only a handful had died, mostly of illness, not violence. There were no executions, no massacres, no acts of revenge. It was a record that astonished Allied observers and even Japan's future occupation authorities. The United States had fought a total war, yet within its borders it had preserved a measure of civilization. The contrast with what Allied prisoners had endured under Japanese rule was stark, and the message unmistakable. When the last transport ship disappeared over the Pacific, many of the American guards felt something they couldn't name. Pride, perhaps, but also melancholy. They had seen war's brutality, yet they had been asked to embody its opposite. The enemy was gone, but what remained was the memory of an experiment, a moral one, that had quietly proven itself stronger than any weapon America had built. Soon, that experiment would echo in the unlikeliest of places, in post-war Japan itself. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the world changed with dizzying speed. Tokyo lay in ruins, Hiroshima a scar of silence. But amid the devastation, the seeds planted in those quiet American camps began to bloom in unexpected ways. Many of the former prisoners who had returned home carried memories that clashed violently with the propaganda they had once believed. They had seen the enemy's factories, its kindness, its wealth. They had eaten American food, heard American music, and witnessed something deeper than power: self-assurance without cruelty. For some, that experience became a lifelong compass. In 1947, a former prisoner named Lieutenant Shigeru Yoshida, once held in California, published a short memoir circulated privately among veterans. In it, he wrote, "I arrived expecting to see the demons of our emperor's speeches. Instead, I saw men who gave us food before questions. They did not speak of victory, they lived it." Yoshida later became an educator, teaching young Japanese students about democracy and cross-cultural understanding. Others followed similar paths: writers, teachers, even local officials, men quietly shaped by the dissonance between what they were told and what they had lived. The U.S. occupation authorities under General Douglas MacArthur recognized this phenomenon almost immediately. Reports from intelligence officers noted that former POWs often adapted more quickly to democratic reforms than soldiers who had never left Japan. They were, in a sense, cultural bridges, men who had glimpsed the American system not as conquerors, but as captives treated humanely. In 1951, when the Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the Allied occupation, several Japanese veterans returned voluntarily to the United States. Among them were a handful who had been held in California. They visited old campsites, now long dismantled, standing quietly where the barracks once stood. Photographs from the time show them shaking hands with aging American guards, smiling awkwardly, bowing deeply. One former POW, now a businessman, told a Los Angeles newspaper reporter, "I wanted to see the place where my war ended, where I learned that my enemy had mercy." For the Americans too, the memory lingered. Former guards, now middle-aged fathers, often described the experience as formative, a reminder that moral strength could exist even in the machinery of war. Veterans' reunions occasionally included men who had served on POW detail. They would speak of the desert, the discipline, and the strange intimacy of guarding an enemy without hate. In some cases, unlikely friendships endured. Letters were exchanged between former captors and prisoners. A few met decades later, old men sharing cigarettes once again, this time by choice. In one recorded reunion from 1972, Sergeant Robert McCall met a Japanese ex-prisoner he had once guarded at Blythe. The two sat beneath a museum display of wartime photographs. McCall handed him a copy of an old diary entry and said quietly, "You were the first man I didn't hate in that war." The Japanese veteran nodded, eyes wet, and replied in halting English, "And you were the first enemy who let me live." Moments like that were not history's headlines, but they were its soul. These post-war encounters showed that the human lessons of the camp had not vanished with the fences. They had endured, embedded in memories, shaping attitudes, redefining what victory meant. The ice cream and cigarettes, once symbols of absurd kindness, had become metaphors of civilization. They were proof that America's greatest triumph was not only industrial or military, but moral, the quiet power to change a man's mind without breaking his body. As the decades passed and the veterans aged, many wondered if those lessons would survive them. Whether nations in future wars would remember that mercy can be as strategic as firepower. That question, the meaning of decency amid destruction, would form the lasting legacy of the desert camps. And it would be answered finally in reflection, not by soldiers, but by history itself. In the great ledger of World War II, with its oceans of blood and its mountains of ruin, the story of a few thousand Japanese prisoners in California might seem like a footnote. Yet history is often written not in headlines, but in the quiet spaces where choices of conscience are made. The desert camps were more than logistical necessity. They were a statement. A nation at the peak of its power, the United States of 1944, could have answered hate with hate. It could have mirrored the cruelty shown to its own captured soldiers in the Pacific. But it didn't. Instead, it chose order, law, and restraint. That choice was not sentimental. It was strategic. It showed the world that America's strength did not depend solely on weapons or industry, but on principle. The belief that civilization must endure even when war threatens to erase it. For the Japanese soldiers who had seen only the brutality of combat, that realization struck deeper than any defeat. They entered the camps believing the United States was decadent, fractured, soulless. They left understanding that abundance, kindness, and discipline could coexist, that democracy, far from being weakness, was power under control. Many historians later observed that this moral contrast played a subtle but significant role in reshaping Japan after the war. The men who had once stood in those California deserts carried back stories that undermined decades of militarist myth. They told their families about American organization, about the taste of bread and ice cream, about the enemy's strange gentleness. In their retelling, America became less an abstract monster and more a civilization. Powerful, flawed, but profoundly human. For the guards and officers who served there, the experience carved an equally lasting mark. They had been asked to embody the values they fought for, to demonstrate that freedom without discipline was chaos, and discipline without humanity was tyranny. In the act of controlling others without cruelty, they learned what it meant to truly win a war of ideals. As decades passed, the desert swallowed the remains of those camps. The barbed wire rusted away, the watchtowers collapsed, but the lessons survived. In memoirs, letters, and the rare photographs that captured men on both sides, standing together, half smiling, half uncertain of what the moment meant. One image remains emblematic. A group of Japanese prisoners, seated on wooden benches, eating ice cream, while a young American guard leans against a post, watching them with a faint grin. The desert sun flares in the frame, bleaching out half the scene. In that single image, the paradox of the war is laid bare. Violence and civility, defeat and dignity, all sharing the same silence. Historians would later call America's prisoner of war system an achievement of organized decency. Others saw it as a mirror held up to the chaos of the age, proof that, even when nations lost themselves in total conflict, individuals could still act with grace. In that sense, the camp in California was not merely a place of confinement. It was a test, one that measured whether humanity could survive mechanized war. And it did. When the wind moves through the Mojave now, it passes over the same ground where men once learned that enemies could be human, that mercy could be strength, and that civilization could endure even in the heart of destruction. The war that began with bombs and fanaticism ended there with something entirely different. A spoonful of melting ice cream in the desert sun, a cigarette shared between former enemies, and a quiet truth that still echoes through history. In the end, victory belongs not to those who destroy, but to those who remember their humanity.